event, so we're just making sure that everything is set up. I think we are good to go. Excellent. Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to our discussion on the evolution of open source geospatial intelligence, very kindly hosted by Esri UK. My name is Juliana Zeus, and I'm the research analyst and policy lead for space as part of the military sciences team here at RUSI. Now, open source intelligence has been a game changer, undeniably. I'm probably preaching to the choir in this room. And space assets have been at the front and center of this. From traffic jams just outside of Kiev to atrocities conducted in Bucha, the past year has truly highlighted this. But also the wider confluence of how these new technologies are interacting with data processing and techniques have reshaped the intelligence world, both inside and outside of government. I have two excellent speakers joining me today to talk about their work on this. Number one is Will Marshall, who is the chairman, co-founder, and CEO of Planet. And Will is a scientist turned entrepreneur with extensive experience building and leading teams in the technology space at NASA and now at Planet, having grown the team from the garage all the way to the public company it is now with over 800 people. And then we have my colleague, James Byrne, who is the director of RUSI's open source intelligence and analysis team. And the team has published a number of reports that investigated, for example, the supply chain of the UAV Orlan, but also a report called Silicon Lifeline, Western Electronics at the Heart of Russia's War Machine, that outlined the extent to which the Russian military modernization program has been reliant on electronics from the US, Japan, South Korea, and Europe, and which was based on the technical inspection of Russian military equipment that was captured in or fired at Ukraine. But you're not here to talk with me or to hear from me, so I'll hand over to Will straight away.
Well, great. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. Hopefully people can online as well. It's great to be here. Thanks all for coming. Going to talk a little bit about, I guess, can somebody bring up the slides? How does that work? You going to do it? Perfect. Well, we're here obviously to talk about satellite data in part of this broader change in open source intelligence and how it's playing a part in changing the nature of warfare, bringing transparency and accountability.
Sorry, Will Marshall presentation. No, right. Yeah.
You could do a little roulette on that and see what we get. Okay, so of course, Ukraine being front and center to as an example of what's going on, it's been really fascinating to watch all the organizations leverage satellite data along with other open source intelligence, such as drone data, TikTok videos from their phones, and triangulate what's going on in and around Ukraine. This is the Snake Island, the day the Ukrainians actually took it back. A little bit of background about Planet before we dive into Ukraine, but is that Planet, we did a mission to image the entire Earth every single day, recognizing that more regular imagery of the planet would be good for a wide variety of use cases across civil, government, defense and intelligence, commercial, non-profit, research and education use cases. And we actually just went public as a public benefit corporation, which is a new form of corporation where the fiduciary duty of the directors is not just to the shareholder value, but also to our broader mission. It actually writes in our mission into the charter of the organization, into the DNA of the organization, if you like. And I think it's a really important thing when we're dealing with security and important questions of who should access data and so on. This is a very old picture now, but Rob thought he would put it in, basically of us in the garage, as was mentioned before. That was about 11 years ago now, where we first built our satellites. Taking a very different approach to the satellite design and build process, learning from Silicon Valley, who did early release often on software, sort of trying to employ that general philosophy to satellites. And we've launched over 500 satellites, operate the largest Earth imaging fleet in human history. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that. But it started from this desire to go very differently and faster and more iteratively, and much smaller satellites, right? So instead of being the size of this room roughly, or the double-decker bus, these satellites are this big, or the size of a fridge, somewhere in those sort of range, so 5 to 150 kilograms in mass. And really that's the revolution that's underpinning what I'll get to in a second, which is really the data upshot. But the satellite backend, what's going on is the miniaturization of electronics is enabling us to put much more sensing capability into smaller packages. We've seen about 1,000-fold improvement in data bits per cost going up over the last 5 to 10 years, which is it's like the mainframe to desktop computer change in the computer industry. And that is what's underpinning the change in space. The rockets have also got a little bit cheaper by about 4x, and that has also helped in the recent couple of years. But the primary thing is this 1,000x is the dominant thing. It's more capabilities in each kilogram going to orbit. We have this agile aerospace. We also very much drive towards democratization of these data, especially through tools that build on top of the data, and leveraging cloud-based and cloud-first systems. Hopefully this will work. This is a little video of how the satellite fleet works that we have in orbit today. So we have about 200 satellites in polar orbit, in a sun-synchronous orbit. They go over the poles. Each one takes a strip of images. It's just continuously imaging. We put up enough so that basically the Earth rotates underneath a shell of these satellites such that they image the entire planet every day. We call it a line scanner for the Earth. And that's been in operation now for 7 years. And so every single day for the last 7 years, we've imaged every point on the landmass of the Earth and nearby coastal waters. And then we also have a higher resolution fleet, about 21 satellites at 50 centimeter resolution that can image any particular location up to 10 times per day, but that's a TAR system. And then the third axis of a stool, if you like, is the analytics that we put on top of that to enable people to extract out information. So those 2 satellite fleets are the top 2. We're also working on a next generation fleet. Just before I left the offices in San Francisco, I was inspecting the Pelican. It was our first tech demo of a satellite fleet that we're going to be launching to do 30 centimeter imagery up to 30 times per day. And most importantly, 30-minute latency from tasking a satellite to getting the image back of any location on the Earth's surface. Via satellite backhaul rather than waiting for the satellites to have to go over our ground stations. Tanager is a fleet that we're starting that is hyperspectral. So these will have 400 spectral bands, each 5 nanometers wide, enabling us to, it's a principal mission focused on gas emissions like methane, CO2, and other point source gas emitters so that we can detect leaks and things, but also it has a strong biodiversity mission and a strong national security mission as well. Perhaps the most unique thing about Planet is the deep archive of imagery of the planet. We have now 2,400 images on average on each location on the landmass of the Earth. And it's incredibly important for what I'll talk towards the end about AI and how we leverage it to extract value from this, because this is the training data set for all of that. And it provides an historical archive to go back and do what we call planetary forensics, that is search for things back through time. Some of the applications we're focused upon here, we focus mainly on the defense and intelligence one here, but our data is also used in agriculture, and commercial applications around that. Forestry, forest management, emergency response in the civil government territory, insurance, like doing parametric crop insurance that's automated without having to send people out to the crop fields and so on. Civil government, like disaster response, but also various other things like monitoring agricultural subsidies and things like that. Planet's really evolving from what was really a satellite company to start with. We had to prove out that we could build and operate these satellites to what we really are today as a data company, producing about 40 terabytes a day of imagery. It's about 4 million 47 megapixel images of the Earth taken each day. It's designed with machine learning in mind, meaning we aren't designing this to be looked at with a naked eye so much as for the machine learning to detect objects in an automated way, and very much evolving towards a future of being a platform company, meaning where people really build an ecosystem of applications to drive value out of the imagery. Three main areas where Planet's data fits in is really digital transformation of industries like agriculture, where we can improve crop yield, sustainability. That's where we're tracking deforestation or tracking ice caps or tracking coral reefs and sensitive biodiverse areas, and peace and security, which we'll talk about more. In Ukraine, I just wanted to set the scene a tiny bit. We're seeing three main kinds of use cases. One is the operational use by countries to help with intelligence for Ukraine, like we're supporting the United States and the UK governments to help their intelligence support of Ukraine. The second is how we're helping NGOs, empower NGOs to do research, think tanks to do research, and help with things like medical supplies, food supplies, and I'll give a couple of examples there. And then thirdly, where appropriate, sharing with the media to shed light so that everyone gets to see what's going on, bringing transparency to these events. A couple of examples. The day before the invasion, the Russian government had stated that they were going to pull back. We had seen in our imagery this bridge that was built literally the day before that invasion was supposed to, the pullback was meant to be happening. And it was part of the reasons everyone called their bluff. And there's a zoom in on that pontoon bridge there. That's between, this is between Belarus and northern Ukraine. And it's the scan of all of Ukraine every day where we find new threats, as opposed to looking at the threats that we knew to look at, or the challenge, it's not just that border crossing or Chernobyl or that port, but finding the new challenge that we didn't know to look for, the attacks on some grain silos, a new border crossing, as this is illustrating, or what have you. We tend to be the first to find things that are happening. Here's an attack on Kherson Air Base. In the aftermath, this is the successful attack by the Ukraine government on the Saki Air Base in Crimea the day before and the day of. And obviously, a lot of the use cases on the government side are very much behind closed doors, but some of the NGOs shed light on leveraging this data for various uses. For example, here, Eyes on Russia is a project that leverages satellite data along with other open source intelligence data to enable everyone to look at events and try to confirm and triangulate events. In this case, is an attack on a grain facility. This is some work we did for the United Nations, who had asked us to look at whether we could do building damage assessment across Ukraine. So on the right-hand side, you can see buildings damage. It actually assessed the type of building, the degree of damage, and then could assess how many hospitals, schools, residential buildings and other kinds were destroyed or what condition they were in, primarily to help with returning displaced people back into those places and then to assess what's going to cost to rebuild Ukraine. Interesting enough, that took several months to develop and deploy. In the aftermath of the Turkey earthquake, we managed to deploy that system in just about 48 hours. We had people on the ground and then building by building damage report. And this is in collaboration also with Microsoft. Another collaboration we did was with NASA Harvest, who leveraged our data to look at food across Ukraine. So field by field, every single field, looking at what type of crop, as you can see on the left-hand side, and how well was that crop doing. Remarkably, pretty well. The farmers across Ukraine were able to still continue their farming. So the crop yield was overall not much worse than it was the prior year. However, 22% was under Russian control. And then it was discovered that a fair bit of that grain was being siphoned off and taken illegally. And in fact, some investigative journalists used it to establish that the Russians were stealing grain and taking it to Turkey and Syria, tracking vessels, leveraging this data. And this was the piece about that. I think the Economist put it really well, if you summarize what's going on here, that open source intelligence is lifting the fog of war. I think it's being used remarkably skillfully by the Ukraine government itself, but it is also being used by this plethora of open source actors, think tanks, researchers around the world to shed light on what's going on and enable the whole world to see. And I think transparency through this sort of data and analysis is bringing accountability to these events. And it's not just in Ukraine, of course. Satellite data can be used all around the world for these kind of purposes. This is when some researchers leverage our data to spot more than 100 new nuclear missile silos in China. Some other journalists actually leveraged our data to find 370 Uyghur detention camps and expose them in China, to give another example. And this is one where we work with RUSI on, and they'll tell you a little bit more about this maybe, but ship-to-ship transfers in violation of the North Korean sanctions that enable oil transshipments to North Korea. Final example I just wanted to give is what's going on in AI is really interesting. Firstly, we've had the classical finding roads, buildings, ships, planes, but the large language models are bringing a new sort of capability. And I want to illustrate that with this example of the balloons that were flying over the US. And we were asked, can we find those balloons? And the answer was yes. And yes, and we could trace them back. They actually stuck out like sore thumbs because we can see them in the different imagery bands, taken at slightly different angles. And basically, as the satellite flies overhead, we see it at a slightly different place. And so they actually were quite easy to spot. And we trained an algorithm with our colleagues at Synthetic AI who enabled the backtracking of finding these locations all the way to its launch site, and found its launch facility and published where that was. Very excitingly, this algorithm basically is a generic kind of algorithm that you can ask it to find any object once it's trained. You don't have to retrain it. I could now ask the same algorithm for tennis courts and it'll go and find tennis courts, or ships of a certain kind and it'll go and find ships of that certain kind, or missile silos or what have you. You don't have to retrain. It's train once and then find any kind of object, which I think is a fascinating advance on where we're going. Really, Planet's future is about building an Earth data platform that empowers an ecosystem of actors, commercial, government, researchers around the world to extract that information and help us to take care of the Earth, to bring about a more sustainable future and a more secure one. And I'll give this closing thought. Just imagine what you could do if you had access to daily imagery of the planet. I can talk more, but wrap it up for now and we'll get into questions after James. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Will. And now we'll go over to James to hear how that kind of imagery is applied.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks. Let's just switch this presentation up. And then maybe I'll put yours up. Yeah, sure. So you're going for this one down here, OSINT. You got it? Right. Yeah, I know. It's all good. Hello, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here and to have you all here. It's actually something that we've tried to do for a long time. So I know Rob here at Planet has tried to make this happen, and Ralph, who I believe may be watching, tried to make this happen for a long time. So I just want to thank you for doing it, and thank Will for coming. I think it's a cool thing to do. I think we should have more of these kind of events. And I'd also like to thank very much Esri for helping us host this. Esri is a really important partner for us as well as Planet because of the platform that we use. But what I want to talk about today a bit is you know, what we do, how we use this data, how we do our sort of GEOINT work, and give you a few case studies about what it is. So I would never have known, starting this, you know, really quite a long time ago, that we'd be in a place that we can see anywhere in the world every day, that we can actually, with unclassified sources, listen from a satellite to somebody's communications, which I saw really just a few weeks ago. We're just in an incredible space, and it's evolving so quickly. And it's some of the stuff that can be done is absolutely mind-boggling. So, you know, the tracking of the balloon that we just saw, I believe that was Christian as well at the New York Times that we've worked with before. But just some of the stuff is unbelievable. It's like science fiction. But what isn't science fiction is getting sued. So this is our disclaimer. You know, the lawyers always insist we put up the disclaimer, and it is important, and I assume that everybody has read it and gone through it dutifully. Some of the work we do, obviously, as a think tank is, you know, has risks, because we are interested in investigating companies and people and activities, and so it is there for good reason. But for some of you who don't know what RUSI is, we're a think tank. We're based on Whitehall, a very old think tank established in 1831. And I think for those days, for geospatial, they use balloons. So the Chinese have gone back to it by the looks of it. But so we started off a long time ago just doing military sciences, but today we do all sorts of cool things. We have you know, a large team of people doing really amazing things at RUSI. Some of them are in this room, from military sciences to counter-proliferation finance to all sorts of really, really cool things. So, you know, we do encourage you to come to our building. Actually, it's getting renovated on 61 Whitehall. It's going to be open soon. We're moving back in. It's going to be great. So, you know, who are we at RUSI? Well, we're a small team of people, and we do what we call open source intelligence. It is not always open source in the sense that we do field work, and some of our sources are journalistic, you know, and we work together with journalists a lot. But what we've been trying to do really is to leverage all of these cool data sets, right? To put them together in certain platforms, to layer them, to triangulate them, to be able to generate intelligence products that are useful, both for the public, but also for certain customers. And we're going to talk about some of that stuff in a minute. You know, we've worked on a you know, quite a large number of things with these tools and techniques. We've worked on North Korean procurement networks, proliferation networks, the weapon smugglers. We've worked on the oil smugglers. We love the maritime space. We've been doing that stuff for a long time. We've worked on Russia. We've worked on China. We do lots of interesting different projects. Not all of them are public, but we've been doing this for a while. One of the most important sort of geospatial workflows that we have and that we've developed ourselves over the years is just taking all sorts of different things and layering them together and seeing what comes out of it, right? So I started this like a very, very long time ago, just with like AIS, and I thought this is super interesting, AIS, and so I started to database it, buy it, and database it with my brother, and we never knew that we'd be in this space now where we can do this stuff. But so what we do is on a normal day, which is, let's say we're working on North Korean vessels or the North Korean smugglers, we're trying to catch them. We're layering lots of different AIS providers and data together. We're putting it on top in ArcGIS of Sentinel-1 or Sentinel-2 or PlanetScope, which is absolutely key for us. If we have things of interest, you know, significant interests that we think are going on, we task imagery, often with Planet SkySat, so low latency. We try and get images of the vessels meeting. We've been pretty successful at that. And we do all sorts of other stuff on top of that, right? So, you know, IHS data for ports, social media. Sometimes one of the craziest things is that sailors will actually put videos of the illicit transfers on TikTok. And you're like, yes, we've got him. So, you know, what you can find is really sometimes just limited to your ability to go out there and, you know, dig it out to find it. And on top of that geospatial workflow, we put other stuff then. Then we're looking at the people, we're looking at the networks, we're looking at the companies, and we're trying to put that all together to deliver products that are actionable, that could be given to law enforcement and sometimes have been, so that we can essentially disrupt those networks. That's part of one of the big workflows of what we do. what is happening these days is as well, using platforms like Esri's platform is just a really interesting ability to do really cool geoprocessing analysis and geoanalytics. So this is a relatively complex piece of work that we did, which is layering lots of different data sets, right? Layering all sorts of things, because what we wanted to find was where the transfers happened, and why did they happen in those places? Right, nobody, to our knowledge, had ever looked at why ship-to-ship transfers, especially illicit ship-to-ship transfers, happened in certain areas. And what we did and what we found was actually a number of really interesting commonalities between those transfers. They happen in places where obviously there's low current, there's certain tidal conditions, there's anchorages. And that is essentially the layering of all of this different geospatial data and putting it into platforms to do that analysis. But the game is changing, right? There's a huge amount of change in this game that's happening every day. And it's difficult to keep up for it because you've got to sign a lot of contracts and they've got to go through an NDA process and they've got to go through our RUSI system, which sometimes takes a while. Longer these days because Carolyn at the back left. Anyway, lots of cool stuff is happening. Right, so low latency, high resolution tasking of images. So getting really high resolution images really quickly. And that's what Will and I were just talking about the Pelican. We're very excited to be able to see that and use it in the future to be able to capture stuff. Radio frequency data, RF data from people's VHS on ships or on the border with Ukraine will be unclassified and will ultimately be open source one day pretty soon. And actually some of it already is. That is, an incredible thing to sit there and be able to listen to somebody's communications, who's conducting an illicit transfer at sea of North Korean oil. It's unbelievable. Hyperspectral imagery. We have a really interesting project at RUSI. We're starting it now, looking at North Korean chemical weapons facilities or alleged chemical weapons facilities. It's very difficult to do, but hyperspectral may be just a key part of that story. You might be able to tell all sorts of interesting things from the chemical signatures of that stuff. And of course, there's really high resolution, increasingly high resolution EO imagery. Like that's a beautiful Airbus image of Pyongyang, right? Which also it looks like Sims 2 or one of the computer games. To be honest with you, when I look at it. So what do we do and what do we turn that into? So what we try and do with that stuff is, a range of products. Sometimes we generate, very often we generate lots of intelligence products, which are actually tactical. And we try to make them relevant, sort of deliver at the speed of relevance. And so, this is an example. This is often what we've been doing is like tracking people, tracking vessels, tasking a satellite image of it, in the evening, getting it delivered in the morning, if there isn't cloud and you've just wasted a ton of money, getting it delivered in the morning, processing it, putting it into an intelligence product, which is layered with all sorts of things and delivering it a few hours later. I think our record at the moment, Joe, is 2 hours, 3 hours, something like that. Very, very quick. And that then goes off to people that can sometimes do something about it. And that's very gratifying, and it just wouldn't be possible without this. One of the other things that's really, really interesting about open source intelligence, and I just don't think, not everybody has realized this, is the ability to layer like an OSINT and analytics process, a really robust one, on top of like unique data sets. So that's some of the things that we try and do, is, acquire very, very unique data sets, through journalistic methods or through field work, and then stack on top of it like a big OSINT project, right? So we did that recently. We've had essentially we've been doing quite a bit of field work in Ukraine, collecting components and the data of how Russian weapons platforms are built, what's inside them, what microelectronics are inside them, and then putting on top of that, a way to figure out the supply chains, right? As sort of essentially a sort of geospatial as well map of how these supplies are moving into Russia. So it can be really, really powerful. One of the other things we've been doing, using both PlanetScope, and I think this is, as Will said, it is just the future, is machine learning and AI algorithms for ship detection, ship identification. So we built one a while ago, I think it was like 2019, 2018, to count vessels in synthetic aperture radar data, right? So SAR data. So, So one interesting story was that, before the pandemic, or, as the pandemic was kicking off, what we saw with the algorithm was, and we hadn't spent the time like human counting it, was just this huge buildup of vessels outside of North Korea, right? And ultimately that was the story. There had been essentially, they'd blocked the port, the vessels had built up, and that was just an alert system. It'd be very, very difficult for an analyst to do that. We also built like ship identification algorithms, which is a really interesting tool. It's essentially a human machine loop. The computer makes guesses at who it thinks a vessel is, and then the analyst essentially validates it or rejects it, and the algorithm learns. Those are just really, really interesting things that are going to happen at an increasing scale. They're just going to free up huge volumes of analyst time to do this stuff, right? Because, like Joe and I and people at RUSI, we spent like years like learning how to ID the North Korean ships, and it's difficult sometimes, but this is just, the machine just pulls out all of the examples of it, feeds you possibilities, and you go, yes, yes, no, no, yes, yes, no. So I don't know, how long have I been talking? 10 minutes. 10 minutes, I got a bit longer. So I don't know, like the FT, somebody from the FT was supposed to come here, but I don't know if they are. Is Sam here? Oh yeah, there you are. Okay, lovely to have you. This is something that we just released with the Financial Times. It really was for us a labor of love. We've been working on this particular case for years. The reason that it looks so good here is because Sam at the back there is a very, very talented individual. But this was really a huge story. It was a story of the smugglers who'd been moving oil to North Korea in violation of sanctions. It's an incredible documentary. It's on YouTube. It's worth watching. But that would not have been possible, right? It just would not have been possible without the images that we could task of the vessels to prove that they were doing the transfers. That is like the core part of the story. And then we worked back, and it took us years to get behind who was really responsible for these activities. And the answer to that question is really quite a shocking one. Who is the real people we believe behind the transfer of oil to North Korea? I do urge you to watch it. It's a great piece of work. And it looks amazing, but it's ultimately a geospatial story backed onto a huge amount of investigative journalism and open source research and analysis into the networks behind that. It all started, that particular story all started with vessels delivering to North Korea that were not North Korean vessels. And you're like, who are these people? Who are these vessels? What are they doing? And we spent absolutely ages trying to work it out. But it doesn't, there's lots of like maritime work now being done with all of this geospatial data, right? But it really isn't just a story about maritime work. It's a story about all sorts of things. This was a big piece we did a few years ago, trying to understand the cross-border networks between China and North Korea. What it involved was just a huge extraction of data sets of companies, of people, and of trade data, essentially, to try and work out what was going on. And mapping that on a very large scale, which actually that was done by hand. Probably these days we try not to do it by hand because it takes ages. And I think that's close to the end. One of the really interesting things that is happening now, and this speaks again to the AI and to the ML picture, is the collection of data, the processing of data, the automated entity resolution. So we have another partner called Altana who does essentially a map of the global supply chains. And it's mapping huge volumes of trade data across supply chains and doing automated entity resolution. And that's just like a key mechanism for tracing, especially in our case, Russian military supply chains, and trying to work out, okay, where in the world is this stuff moving? How is it getting there? And how do we put a stop to it? So there's just so many things going on. I think it's a very, very exciting time for geospatial intelligence and for open source intelligence. It just allowing us to answer all sorts of questions and solve all sorts of puzzles that we could never do before. I just think it's just such an exciting time to be in it. Please do come and speak to us afterwards. We're always happy to meet people. We're happy to meet people that have data. And thank you very much for hosting us, Esri and Planet, and Will for coming. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. We will do a Q&A, so there will be a roving microphone in the room, but also to those joining online, feel free to submit your questions. I'll see them right here in front of me on the iPad, so please do feel free. Do we have any immediate questions from the floor? Oh, we do.
Yeah, thank you all very much. I've been scribbling notes like it's going out of fashion. The name's Ewan Grant. I'm a RUSI member. I was the old Customs and Excises intelligence analyst for the ex-Soviet states. I've done quite a lot of consultancy work, particularly in Ukraine. And I saw for years how Ukrainian warnings were being ignored. My two quick questions, one technical, one more organizational and human. What are the particular likely technical advances in the next few years that will make an impact to the work you're all doing? Where are the bottlenecks on that, where perhaps hype has got ahead of things? And on the human side, who are the organizations who are not paying attention to what you're doing and what you can do? Thank you.
Well, do you want to start on that one?
Yeah, sure, happy to. Well, to the latter thing, I think, latter question, I think many organizations are not paying attention to this. I think most are not paying attention to what's going on. Yeah, I mean, I think that's partly why we're here, right? So thanks for coming. And, you know, where's the technology going? Better and better data. That means better in all three resolution types. So spatial resolution, temporal resolution, spectral resolution. They're going to get better as the satellites get better and better. You know, every time we launch new satellites, they produce, you know, maybe 5 or 10 times more data each time than the prior iteration. And so that is going at some sort of equivalent of Moore's law in exponential increase because, again, of the miniaturization of sensors and compute. But probably the more important thing is where the algorithms are going. And here there's both reality and hype. I think computer vision has already shown itself to be pretty able to help this sector grapple with all this data sets and do large scale analysis of the type that James was just showing, like monitoring the whole South China Sea for vessels. There's a lot more potential there, as I was saying, those sort of planetary forensics. Just go back in time and search for all these balloons. Where do they fly? That sort of thing should be possible on the fly, relatively low compute costs. Now, those sort of analyses, just imagine, were the province of entire, you know, superpower states 50 years ago. And now we can do it a click of a button with anyone in a think tank, right? I mean, what a profound change. On the other hand, there's lots of caution there too. We've seen issues of inaccuracy. Large language models make stuff up occasionally. They call it hallucination. I call it making stuff up. You know, so we have to be wary of that applying in this field as well. The thing that I'm most worried about is deep fakes and how that can affect the world. I think one of the massive advantages we have, I'll talk of two. One is open source intelligence really battles with the challenge of post-truth era online, in my opinion. You know, we have this challenge of misinformation spreading like wildfire on social media. And generally, I think that's a real challenge for democracies and for open societies, actually. So this is a real problem. It's easier to deal with if you're autocratic. On the other hand, open source intelligence generally favors open societies because it brings accountability and transparency. And so those two things are at odds with one another. I really hope that open source intelligence is going to push back that. But we have to get really good at things like digital certificates that enable us to verify the source of an image, whenever you see it, that you can click back through to the original and that you can verify that it came from whichever actor and so on. Otherwise, we're going to have a challenge with deepfakes spreading still within this confines of this sort of area. Again, open source intelligence, I'm really, I think, pleased to say that this transparency helps open societies more than closed ones. And I think we'll see that play out. And that's why I think it needs even more energy and attention, especially in the current world.
So I agree with that 100%, actually. I think it's a really interesting thought. To go on the questions of like bottlenecks, there are a few bottlenecks with this stuff. Like one is obviously cost. It's difficult to be able to pay for all of this stuff. It's expensive. And so, it's difficult for small institutions to do it. Two is just, when we've had and curated and held very, very large data sets of like several like terabytes, it becomes very difficult for small organizations to do that, and really, really expensive. So all of this stuff is obviously, it's one is a question about money. Two is a question about, like handling, as everything gets bigger, it becomes difficult to handle. And I think that's a problem pretty much everywhere.
Hi there. Thank you very much for that. It's all really, really interesting. Nick Loxton from GeoINT. The issues that you've identified, absolutely agree with, and I think they do present clear problems moving forward. So to me, it seems as if that solution comes in education. So of the users who are going to be taking the sources that are presented to them and then processing it into an actionable intelligence product or whatever it may be. But there's no clear unified program on the utilization of geointelligence or open source intelligence. A lot of it is self-taught, a lot of it is startup companies who don't have the time resources to dedicate to training. So in your opinion, who should own the training to make this into the viable product that it needs to be and it will become eventually? Thanks.
James, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I mean, well, I don't know if anybody should own it, but just to give you a sort of vignette from where we are, we have quite a few projects on this, right, doing this kind of work, and there's not really a shortage of this kind of work. But one of the problems that we face is you can't really go to university and just hire somebody that has any of these skills, whether it's GIS platforms for intelligence purposes, or it's just difficult to find those people. And so I've sort of struggled with that. We've struggled with that in thinking about how we could improve that. I've had a few conversations with universities about it, and I think it would be great, it really would be great if there was an initiative in the UK to sort of expand education in this space, because there's so much that could be done. And I think, it's a really interesting sector. Lots of people want to work in this sector, but a lot of the people just don't have the skills, right? And so what you end up finding, you're right, is the people that come into it, the people that are good at it, just people that are self-taught and that have just spent a lot of time themselves just doing this stuff, which is not a bad thing for think tanks, because you do want entrepreneurial people. But it would be good to have initiative, or it'd be good if there were universities that offered sort of more hands-on skilled like training in this stuff. But I think, and it's a reaction, or it's a consequence of the actual changing nature of intelligence, because it was once, essentially owned by governments. It was classified intelligence, and so they owned the training pipeline. Obviously, they needed it, but as it spread, there isn't a corresponding training in sort of civil society. So, let's start a course at university. Maybe that's the solution. Do you want to?
I'd only add that, of course, it's also just getting easier, right? So that's a good thing, because it shouldn't just be that stovepipe bespoke applications in some very specialized field. I do think we should add education. I do think we should. There's a lot of opportunity there, because there's so much economic opportunity as well as security opportunities in this space with this new load of data sets and analytics that sit on top. But the analytics are making it such that you less and less have to have that PhD in GIS in order to get somewhere, right? It's becoming easier and easier. we talked about at our Explore conference, the fact that you can imagine a more queryable interface to satellite data, a bit like Chat GPT. You know, you can imagine a Planet GPT that sort of enable one to just write questions and get answers based on that geospatial, the back end, all seamlessly being queried. That's where things are heading. And I think that actually is democratizing and empowering. We're seeing a lot of proliferation and open sourcing of AI tools that enable this to be democratized.
Thank you. And I think we have it now on the record that you basically volunteered to write a syllabus, right?
Yeah, I'll use ChatGPT 4 for it.
Excellent. Excellent. I was waiting for when the ChatGPT jokes would come in. We have a question there from Dan.
Hi, g'day, how you going? Dan Liu from Conflict Armament Research. Will, you talked about how open societies are inherently more resilient and authoritarian societies are sort of on the defensive for this sort of technological change. What worries both of you about the type of access and data sources that authoritarian regimes could sort of turn on and turn off for? Because I'm guessing, like us investigators, we all are sitting on interesting sources that are from adversarial countries that we're constantly worried about the tap turning off.
Turning off, you're saying? From, well, I don't know exactly what you're getting at. Maybe you have better ideas, but I would say that the vector of these things on social media is our own challenge that we've invented ourselves and inflicting on ourselves in democracy. And so that's the challenge from my perspective. And most of the development of, at least in the space sector, of news information data sets are companies in Europe and the US anyway. And so I don't think that's going to be a subject to being closed off by other countries. I don't know if exactly that answers your question.
Hey, nice to see you. I mean, I haven't thought about it properly yet, but you know, I think I know what you're saying. I think this goes into Will's point though, right? So let's take China, right? Like China, it was relatively easy to get all sorts of Chinese data, right? Company data, legal cases, all sorts of things, and that is gradually being cut down and switched off, just partly because of the work that you know, journalists and think tanks are doing, and that is, you know, obviously that'll impact this kind of work, but it's going to make China, you know, just an increasingly difficult place to do any business with, to have any due diligence processes with, to invest in, outbound capital flows. And so I think it goes exactly to Will's point. It's going to push them towards the darkness, whereas the essentially open source and just the increase of that data is good for open society. So it's also an interesting sort of philosophical parallel on what's happening between, for example, you know, our countries and China. Saying that though, obviously the EU has been great recently in cutting access to a range of different data sets as well. But I don't know, does that answer it? Yeah.
I think we have a similar-ish question online, so we'll go to that first from Timothy Jenkins, who's asking, are the panel seeing autocratic regimes and transnational criminal groups utilizing commercial Earth observation data to evade sanctions and conduct operations like a dark mirror to open source intelligence?
I haven't seen anything like that, but of course, there is a cat and mouse at some level that is kind of obvious that comes out of this. But I think it's increasingly hard to hide. You know, the Indian government famously developed a lot of their nuclear programs, knowing when the US spy satellites were going across and sort of moving their trucks at different times, right? I think that's harder and harder as the future comes up because of the frequency of the data. So I wouldn't want to be on the other side of that one.
So repeat it again. Let me hear it again. I'll tell you an interesting story. Just recently, I saw a certain brochure, and it alleged to be a brochure developed by the North Koreans for a piece of technology, And in that, I thought that they were using Sentinel-1 data. So actually, free data that's available from the EU in a particular brochure that they were, offering some kit for sale. So, potentially, why not, right? Like, why wouldn't North Korea use Sentinel-1, Sentinel-2? I think it probably struggled to get access to Planet, unless they have some front company they're doing it through. But I would imagine it's totally possible that they are. I don't know about transnational criminal groups, but I imagine if you're smuggling large volumes of cocaine across oceans, you might be using AIS. You might have an account on marine traffic. Anyway, I don't know if that answers it, but I would imagine so.
Scope for really following that, you'll come across some real gold dust.
And just to add, there was a private company based in Luxembourg actually that was sanctioned for providing, I think, SAR imagery to Russia, Chinese company based in Luxembourg. Do we have any further questions from the floor? Yes, left-hand side.
Hi, Nick Waters from Bellingcat. Kind of flipping that question a little bit on its head. And firstly, thank you for the talk. It was super interesting. Have you come into conflict, or have you found any conflict between providing this kind of data to civil society, as well as, say, the operational security of Ukraine or perhaps other states that are clients? And if so, what have you done to mitigate that?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely and lots of things, but I don't want to go into it. Thanks.
I don't think that question is for me, so I think I have to speak to him afterwards.
There was another question, I think.
Hi, Magdalene Corrales, Chatham House, working on open source intelligence. I have a question on, you talked about the use of AI, you talked about the progress in AI and how it can be helpful to conducting this kind of analysis. I'm wondering both of your perspectives on the future of that. The last couple of months have seen very, very rapid development, and I'm wondering how you think the future of open source analysis is going to look with the input of AI, both the human research element and the technology research element. Thank you.
You made the ChatGPT joke, so you're up first.
I think what Will said is correct on that. Right. So if you think about it like this, and so we've actually talked about doing it, right? We have just gigabytes and gigabytes of documents relating, let's say, company documents. But why wouldn't we build a box and put everything in there, everything that we have, all sorts of legal case documents, company documents, and then build an AI model on top of it to actually ask it natural language questions, right? So I think that's going to happen very soon, and it's going to really fundamentally change the nature of at least the analysis that we do that isn't geospatial, right? You'll be able to ask the machine to tell you all sorts of questions that would take an analyst days or weeks or months to figure out. And so, I mean, it's quite scary. It's quite exciting to see what happens there. But I think there's going to be really fundamental changes. And I don't know, even if you just sort of play around with ChatGPT or some of the other stuff, you can just start to see some of the incredible impacts it will have and how it will change the practice of what we're doing to some degree, I think.
You said it.
What an efficient panel. I just want to use and abuse my privilege as chair to also throw in a question while you guys think of some more questions. Planet and other companies are basically making available to the public what was previously the reserve of states, right? And we talked about this with, I guess, the new space sector more widely. The launch costs came down back in the 90s because satellites became so much smaller. I mean, we saw it beautifully on that slide you had in terms of sizing. So obviously, we're now able to do stuff that, only a couple of decades ago, it was only states. And I guess it's a two-part question. Number one, how does this sort of additional transparency prevent potential dis and misinformation campaigns? And I guess the second one is also the responsibility as a tech leader and as a company in making that information available.
Yeah, great. Well, we take the latter very seriously. Well, obviously, you know, yes, satellite data is definitely something that was the province of governments and is now not. It's not just that it's providing some of the capabilities that those governments had, it's providing some capabilities they've never had. The world's never had a daily scan of the Earth from any intelligence agency or any government that before. So on the other hand, it isn't providing things that they do have today, and this probably won't for some while. So it's not the same. They're not the same technologies, right? They have different uses. One of the things that the intelligence community really likes about our data is the fact that it's unclassified and shareable, right? So when they can point at things in our data that they couldn't point at from other sources, and that can be helpful. So yeah, and you know, to the point about tech ethics, something we take very seriously, thinking about how do we make sure that this data is used for and has the most good impact on the planet, and isn't used for any malicious purposes, although we think the technology is inherently massively bent towards good, both on the sustainability side and the security side. The more information leads to transparency and accountability, that's generally good. Of course, we're looking at every actor, checking that they're not on embargoes lists, and then we have an ethics committee that review even those that get through that and ensures that they're aligned with our policies and guidelines. So I hope that will lead others to do similar sorts of things. It's a little bit scary that, in a sense, society hasn't got mechanisms for it because it's new tools, right? So I'm very much encouraging governments to really think about thoughtful regulation in this space because it's a new frontier. And I'm the same with my colleagues in the AI community in Silicon Valley, that I think also there needs to be some thoughtful regulation. The challenge is that the technology is evolving so fast that regulation has a hard time keeping up. And our natural mechanisms in democracies for regulating technology take years or decades, but these technologies are coming up from zero to a wide scale impact in society in weeks and months, and that's just broken our technology regulation systems. And so we need totally new institutional forms to regulate technology. I actually have called once in open forum for the establishment of a sort of tech-wise council like Pugwash did in the Cold War, doing track 2 politics to help quickly assess new technology and provide recommendations for companies to adopt, because we need something like that. And it's a sort of independent but fast-acting body. We try to do our level best to do these things and steer it the best we can, both as stewards of the lower Earth orbit domain and not creating orbital space debris, to how we provide our imagery. And but again, naturally, this imagery is bringing transparency that leads to greater accountability. I think it leads to asymmetric advantages to countries like Ukraine in this sort of situation. It's battling misinformation online, that I think is an important impact on society, and so on. So the net of this is pretty clear, in my opinion. Obviously, I'm biased, but I'd like to think that that's a pretty clear position.
Thank you, Will. Anything to add from your side on disinformation and transparency?
The only thing I would say is be careful what you ask for in terms of regulation, or we'll end up with a satellite imagery license we'll have to pay every year.
And that was James's first and foremost concern. Any further questions from the floor? Yes.
Hi, Jeremy Poulter, Palantir. As we shift towards global transparency, is there a risk of complacency, that you suddenly get to a point where there's an assumption that you have an all-seeing eye on the world, that life is good and nothing, then there'll be no surprises? And the reason I ask that question is certainly in previous military experience, when I've been working with systems of very advanced sensors, I've seen that assumption bite those people. They suddenly, it comes as a heck of a shock, and that's even without advanced deception. Complacency, sometimes it's the known unknown. And I wonder if there is that risk that suddenly there will be a surprise because of this assumption of transparency. I just wonder your thoughts.
Yeah, I think this is a very interesting hypothesis. But let's start by finding the unknown knowns, since they're out there and we can. So meaning that I think that still makes sense, right, as a program for humanity, if you like. And I think that's proving its case and worth in the Ukraine situation today. And by the way, that security element is the same theory of change that's also helping on the sustainability side, tracking and stopping illegal deforestation, illegal fishing, and what have you around the planet is exactly what we need to hold accountability. But I hope, that's a great point to be making, to try and inoculate ourselves that sort of information advantage doesn't mean that we can see all threats of all kinds.
Yeah, so I mean, agreed. I mean, we shouldn't be like hubristic, and I don't think we have an all-seeing eye anyway. Obviously, we do have better information than we once had, but lots of the world and lots of things are still totally in the dark, and it's still very, very difficult to get to the bottom of them. If we talk about that North Korea story, it took us years of work, despite all of the great things that we had and the data that we had, it took a lot of work, and it took journalistic work as well. So I don't think, this doesn't solve all problems. And we definitely shouldn't be hubristic about it. But it's better to have this stuff than not to have it. Much better.
I hope people will forgive me, but now that Will is sitting next to me, I obviously have to ask a space resilience question, as you can't escape. Obviously, just about. These assets have become incredibly useful and have proven their usefulness, I think specifically in the last year. There's obviously a number of counter-space weapons in the broader term, that can prevent the collection of such imagery. I'm thinking, electromagnetic attacks such as jamming or spoofing, cyber attacks. We saw an array of these attacks being carried out against Starlink in Ukraine, but also increasingly laser dazzling, which obviously is the emission of a signal from the Earth up into space to prevent a satellite from taking such a picture. Is that kind of resilience something that Planet is already thinking about? Is this sort of part of your planning over the next couple of years?
Well, it was part of our planning 10 years ago when we established a really large fleet of satellite as a goal, because there's natural resilience in that at some level. I'm not saying that's all answers to all questions, but definitely compared with half a dozen very big satellites, the vulnerability to attack is much, much lower, both from kinetic and electronic systems. That doesn't mean we should be complacent about it. I just think it becomes harder and harder to do. And we saw that at the beginning of the Ukraine war. The Viasat satellite was jammed, in fact, just before the invasion, right? In almost a precursor as trying to turn these things off. But Starlink was proved much harder to do that, and because they have this large fleet of satellites. So I think that it is harder with these large fleets. It doesn't mean that we should be complacent, and we'll try and do everything we can to keep them resilient, and work closely with governments to find out about any efforts the other ways.
No, thank you. I think also with Starlink, it was the software upgrades that actually helped coming around that problem. Any further questions from the floor at this point? Otherwise, poor Will and James are at my mercy, so. No further questions? Okay, a question I do have in terms of the use cases. We've obviously talked a lot about, the ways in which Planet and likewise technology have been helpful in terms of insurance, agriculture, infrastructures. Where do you see those improvements sort of increasing in the next couple of years? What do you think is the sector that can benefit most from this technology, or where's the more growth sort of assumed to be?
Well, I'm most excited by underpinning the carbon credit systems and carbon markets. I think satellite data can play a huge role there. We have to transition to a green economy. A sustainable planet demands that. Our economy is running against the planetary boundaries, and we know which one's going to win. The planet is going to win. It's just a question of how long do we wait before, and how much pain do we cause ourselves between here and there. So at the end of every year, every company, every country tries to balance its books financially. Well, they will all in time have to balance their carbon books and balance their nature impact books. And the first step in that is measurement. So I'm really excited by one future planetary. We have these planetary variables that pull out specific indicators around the planet that are determined, like soil moisture, above ground biomass, soil surface temperature. And we're building one that's called forest carbon. So we've been monitoring forests across the planet, of course, on a regular basis. That's one of our initial mandates, to track every tree on the planet and see if there's deforestation. That was one of the design requirements for the resolution. But now we're turning that with a small company that we acquired called Salo Sciences into forest carbon measurements for every tree around the planet on a regular basis. And that's what's needed to underpin carbon markets, so that a Microsoft that's trying to offset their exec travel and somebody in the middle of nowhere in Amazon can do an exchange based on their Microsoft offsetting their carbon, and those people keeping their trees and not knocking them down, rather than knocking them down in exchange for doing a little bit of money for agriculture, which is what's going on today, agriculture being the biggest driver of deforestation. That little incentive is what we need to do to actually value nature into our economy, and it's all contingent on us being able to accurately measure the carbon in these places, which society is figuring out how to measure, how to value. So I think the Earth observation sector can massively help the accounting systems of that. And by the way, that's a massive economy. Ernst & Young, I looked up the other day, has a revenue of 50 billion a year just on the accounting for people's finances. We're going to need to do all of that again for carbon, for everyone's books, and the regulations coming, the SEC's talked about it in the US, and of course the EU is probably the furthest ahead on all this, and that's fantastic. It's actually already seen the EU implement the Commodities Act that will come into effect next year, which says that any commodity coming into the EU has to prove that it does not cause deforestation in the production of that commodity. Well, how are you going to do that? You're going to have to use satellite data to do that sort of thing at scale. So that's a big change that's coming, and I think satellite data can help with those this entire transition, a multi-trillion-dollar transition to a sustainable economy. So that's what I'm most excited about.
That's very hopeful. And I think it's so astonishing because we forget, again, to what extent space is already implicated in climate change trackers. I think more than 50%, at least by this point, are space-based assets that help us sort of keep track of climate change indicators. I think the problem that I potentially foresee, and maybe I'm the pessimist and you're the optimist on this panel, but is there a danger of having sort of competing narratives in the sense that Earth observation technologies are widespread? So is there a chance of perhaps in a multinational setting that a state might be accused of deforestation or beyond the level that they promised, but then they say, but our sovereign assets told us that's not the case, and it could be a sort of AI faked image that proves the opposite?
Well, that's why I think these digital certificates of a kind on content source creators are going to be critical over the next phase for all sorts of reasons. But I think that's going to be harder and harder. I mean, to just lie on those things, right? I mean, we've seen countries attempt that, but it's the same for war, right? Whether it's mass graves or bombing civilian targets in Ukraine, or whether it's lying about whether or not you're letting companies cause deforestation against your targets set by your country. These things aren't going to go unaccounted for anymore. I think we're coming close to the end of that possibility space. The countries better clean up their act.
Turning to James, you guys have done so much great work over the last couple of years, publishing excellent reports with these new technologies. Where do you think the future of investigative reporting is going?
I It's a difficult one. So a lot of our work, nearly all of our work, is largely like sort of quite adversary focused. You know, so it's looking at North Korean procurement networks or Russian military supply lines. Also, in some cases, you know, sort of Chinese MCF activities. So, I mean, I think we're there. That's because we want to be there. That's something that we're interested in doing. But I just think, you know, obviously this stuff is just massively empowering journalists to do just incredible investigations and layer loads of stuff on top of what were, you know, once upon a time sort of stories based on sources and on the ground reporting. And if you look at, so the story that you put up about the balloon that was done by the MIT visual investigations team, and it was, you know, obviously it's just an issue of huge interest. You know, it was all over the news in the United States when the balloon was going over. And that just allowed them to just tell an incredible story, right, of where the balloon was, where it came from, and ultimately verify that it, you know, they had come from China. So I think that's really, and it goes into what we were saying, that's what this stuff enables, is actually people to know the truth, and for the truth not to be in the darkness or in the shadows. And I think that's really, really important for the future. It's been really important now, because if you look back at the war in Ukraine, right, once upon a time, all of that imagery would have been classified and nobody would have seen it about the troop buildup on the borders with Ukraine. It would have just been in the intelligence agencies and nobody in the public would have known that. But it being in the public and everybody seeing the actual pictures of the massive buildup and then obviously of the invasion, you know, that's just one of the reasons that's really catalyzed support and just undermined the Russian narrative. And so it's just sort of fundamentally changed, I think, the nature of the war and the course of the war. And, you know, hopefully, you know, it's a war that ends soon. But that is the heart of what this stuff can do, and how it can be used for investigations and to tell really important stories. And, you know, it makes it difficult for people to hide. It makes it difficult for some of these people to hide these things, and that's part of the future, I think.
Well, did you want to add anything to that? He said it all. Fantastic. I'm going to ask you guys general geospatial intelligence trends over the next 5, 10, 20 years. What are we going to see?
Well, I sort of said it in the answer to the previous question. I think we're going to get better and better geospatial data. So resolution, temporal resolution, spectral resolution, all of the above. And then better and better analytics that democratizes access to it, right? I mean, it's as simple as that. But I think the AI piece is more profound in its ability to shape this. That point about, you know, we were both saying about how you would have a queryable interface to this sort of data. I mean, I mentioned that in a TED Talk in 2018. Now it feels like it's a few months away, you know? Suddenly we're actually on the verge of being able to do that. That is exciting. I mean, that is massively democratizing. Is it going to be perfect? No, it's but I think that it's very much in favor of open and democratic societies. So I think that is a powerful force.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think that's where we're going, right? It's just more data, but the big game changer, of course, is AI and machine learning. And you know, as Will said, I think he's right. I think it's gonna cause, and it's gonna generate a load of things also that are probably quite hard to foresee. Like, you know, I wouldn't have known we'd be in this position, being able to do this kind of stuff, you know, 5 years ago. So it'll be very interesting to see, and that's why I said it's very exciting. Like, the future of this stuff is very exciting. It's going to be really cool.
Fantastic. There's a question there.
Hi, it's George from Bellingcat. My question is: so you put a lot of hopes for AI in the future and the transformation and democratization as well. There are studies that shows that, for example, 30 queries conversation with ChatGPT equals to half a liter of water. So I wonder how that actually fits into like sustainability that you were talking with your company and the future of democratization. Obviously, if everyone gonna talk and ask questions, like 25 questions about, I don't know, how to write a poem in the style of Shakespeare about something, right? It's gonna be just a waste. And all the efforts that you're gonna put gonna be mitigated, right? What do you think? Thank you.
I think it's a perfectly reasonable line of questioning. I think that we should be thinking about those adverse consequences of that. But a couple of things. Firstly, luckily and for the right reasons, the cloud compute providers are increasingly putting their data centers in places where they get renewable sources of energy, whether it's geothermal or hydro or what have you, wind, solar. And I think that that's the future. Secondly, the amount of compute needed to do these queries is massively changing. Literally a few years ago, to scan for roads across the world with our data would require running an algorithm on all of that data. Now we run the algorithm on all of our data once and then can search for any kind of object on that model, which turns out to be a much, much lower computational challenge than the former, right? Orders of magnitude lower. So I think the direction here is towards much lower compute to get to the same sort of answers. So I think that's pretty exciting. But most of all, this pales in comparison compared with the benefits of protecting our natural ecosystems that satellite data is enabling. We help 64 countries with their work on protecting deforestation, for example. We provide daily alerts to these 64 countries' forestry ministries and various NGOs in those countries. And that has led to, in many cases, more than a 10-fold increase in the ability for those countries to do interventions, whether that's legal interventions or police interventions to stop illegal deforestation. That is extremely heartening. We're talking about massive amounts of illegal deforestation being stopped through these technologies, real-time information to protect our ecosystems. So is it without any cost to the ecosystem? Certainly not. We also have rockets that we have to think about, and those are real costs. But it turns out, I think, it's extremely small compared with the benefits. I mean, not just an order of magnitude or two, maybe 6 or 10, you know. So I think that the benefits are massively in favor in that way, despite that being a great line of questioning in principle.
All right, I'm good. You're good. We have a question at the front here.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Tony Reeves and I'm working with the Planet team. So this is a question for James, really. It's about organisational trust. Clearly, government, states, Ministry of Defence and so on, particularly those in the Five Eyes community, have had access to exquisite sensors and high-level access for a long time. This is a big game changer, the things we've been talking about today. But one of the big challenges that I see is generating trust in those organisations in open source data, in commercialized intelligence as a service, which is kind of what we're talking about. So with your experience, can you tell me how you've particularly approached that problem?
You know, so obviously other institutions here in this room as well, like Bellingcat and Janes and others, and the FT, you know, do similar work to us. And ultimately, it's different work than what the intelligence services do, because number one, all of this stuff goes public, right? And so that's one of the biggest tests of this stuff is to obviously make it public, to get it past lawyers and to get it out there so that you don't get sued, right? So, you know, the conditions on it and the conditions of success are different. And I'd say, you know, obviously the sort of proof is in the pudding, right? Like we've done lots of work. We've generated lots of products that have had impact, that have been used to do all sorts of things, whether they're used in courts of law or whether they're used in different scenarios. But you know, it works and it works and the system works. But so I think it is changing. You know, governments, when we write stuff, when we publish big reports, governments often come and talk to us about the findings. They're often very interested in the kinds of work that we're doing. So I think that is changing. I think the trust, you know, in this stuff is changing, and I think you can see it also just in the proliferation of this work and the incredible impact it's had. So you know, you just look at some of the Bellingcat stuff that they did. It's just incredible, right? And in what it achieved and what it uncovered. So if people still don't think that, you know, that they don't trust the use of commercial sensors, whether it's Planet or Maxar or Airbus, I don't know how to help them, to be honest with you.
Thank you very much. Are there any further questions from the floor? Don't be shy, otherwise there is a reception where you can ask questions as well. All right. All right. In that, no, please.
Yeah, I was only going to say, just to wrap up, just a couple of things that I think I would like to just underscore. 4 things. One is, I think overall what we're seeing is that this data is, and geospatial tools are powering the shift of transparency that leads to accountability. And I think what we're seeing in as a result of that is the advancing of peace and security, especially for those that grapple with this data early on. It's an asymmetric advantage, as we're seeing in the case of Ukraine. It's both a war of tanks and troops, but it's also an information war. And thirdly, it coheres society, because to the point you were just making, everyone's on the same page about what's going on, and it brings accountability to those sort of actions that are against the basic information we're finding. And then finally, it counters misinformation online. And those 4 points together, I think, a pretty powerful story of what's happening in this space. And really, thanks everyone for coming, because I think that we're part of a community that's doing all this together.
Thank you very much, Will. On that note, I would like to thank again Esri UK for hosting us today. There is a reception outside, which is very kindly sponsored by Planet, but also thanks to all of you for your fantastic questions. And please join me in thanking our speakers today.
Oh, so thank you. Yeah.